This is quite a difference in the way of seeing things, and it will inevitably engender conflict, as has been clearly apparent in regards to issues which involve the beginning of life, the value of human life, and the end towards which human life is directed. It's also the reason why appeals made by the advocates of the culture of life, particularly to natural law or to theology, are often met with bewilderment or defiance. The law of nature, in terms of a materialist conception of the universe, means something entirely different than what the church means by the natural law. If one believes that the highest cultural value is removing religion from public life, they are hardly going to consider a theological conception of the human person to be worth consideration. An example of this defiance is manifested in the Supreme Court's decision Casey versus Planned Parenthood, which insisted that each individual should determine for themselves the meaning of human existence. It's also seen in the National Abortion Right Action Leagues and the bioethicist Jacob Appel's claim that they represent a culture of liberty or a culture of freedom, which stands over against the tyrannical claims of a culture of life. This claim to freedom and liberty is an appeal not just simply to a morality that is different than the church's, but an appeal to cultural differentiation. It highlights that the church is existing in relation to another culture, a culture which many of its adherents claim to be part of, that expresses itself in a system of convictions that the church cannot, by its very nature, share without rejecting itself. It is also evidence of one of the components essential to secular culture, which excludes religion or faith as an argument that is worthy of public consideration. Now, to many people in the church, this apparent cultural antagonism is distressing because it did not always seem to be the case. There was a time when the secularity of American culture, a secularity which has been present from the beginning of the American experiment, was not so pronounced. As such, the relationship of the church vis-a-vis the culture was presumed it to be one of accommodation and assimilation. That accommodation and assimilation was possible because the secular component of the American experience could be restrained. Restrained in what way? By a large population of Protestant Christians who shared with us common values. That is no longer the case. For even though a significant portion of the American population continues to profess a kind of Christian faith, they are not culturally Christian. They are secular. The Catholic Church in the United States, which has sought assimilation and accommodation since at least the end of the 19th century, has now found itself in a difficult position. They have to restrain that tendency, much to the bewilderment of many of the faithful. And this is clearly seen in the current conflicts of Catholic politicians who favor the legality of abortion on demand. It had been presumed by many American Catholics that assimilation and accommodation were the strategy of cultural engagement with secularism. But evidently, of late, a threshold has been crossed in terms of the nation's secularity that has necessitated stopping that strategy cold. This has left many of the faithful struggling to understand what then is the proper relationship of the profession of Catholic faith to the participation in the governance of the nation. You might be asking, where does all this leave us? Because we are living at the basic and essential level of the culture of life, the parish and the family. I think that it means that we must place as much, if not more effort, clearly defining and then manifesting in the most concrete way possible, not only what the culture of life stands against, but what it stands for. There are contraries to all the transgressions that Evangelium Vitae names. Yes, we are against, without equivocation, abortion, eugenics, killing the elderly, but what are we for? And how is this given a cultural expression that can be seen and experienced? Such a commitment takes a vision of parish life well beyond the model of sacramental services and special events. The alternative culture that exists, the culture of secularity, is looking very carefully at what we are doing at the most local and concrete levels of our lives. Their issue is to identify what they see as a disconnect between what we profess about the culture of life and the actual practices of the church's culture. Note how there is a prevailing narrative in the secular culture that the church that opposes abortion remains disengaged from the quality of people's lives once they are born. No matter how untrue that narrative is, it prevails as an integral part of a system of convictions that is against the culture of life. It should be our express purpose in our parishes and in our families to demonstrate through cultural activities that this narrative cannot be substantiated on empirical grounds. We should also remember that the power to effect change is not just political and legal, but cultural. If we are who we are as the followers of Christ, boldly and at times defiantly, this can have the effect of substantial cultural change. As a point of fact, the secularism that is currently in ascendancy in America was checked and balanced previously, not simply by law and politics. It was checked and balanced by an alternative cultural form, Christianity. That form of Christianity knew what it was to be a Christian and why Christianity was important, not only individually but culturally. But that form of Christianity, which was Protestant, is no longer intact in the United States. But the culture of life that is the Catholic faith, the reality that we live out as day-to-day Catholics, still remains more or less intact. And as such, this culture of life can still have considerable power as a movement that is contrary to secularity, a power that can be mitigated politically, but can still motivate others in such a way that their beliefs and practices will affirm the culture of life, even if they are not themselves Catholic. In this respect, I think of sociologist Rodney Stark's study of the influence and transformative power of the early church on the pagan cultures of the first 3 centuries after Christ. According to Stark, the momentous change that was inaugurated by the church during this period happened largely because people saw and experienced the manner in which Christians were living, and then they wanted that way of life for themselves. And what did people see in those first Christians? They saw a strange new culture that did not practice infanticide or abortion, that encouraged and supported family life, that reverenced the marriage bond between a man and a woman, that eschewed promiscuous behavior, cared for the sick and the elderly, and sought to live less so that other people might have more. In other words, the pagans saw at the immediate level of their cultural experience the culture of life. That is, they saw the church. Might we take this earliest witness as an example and a model for our own efforts to fully embody and share with others in this culture, the culture to which we belong first and foremost, the culture of the church, which can also be called the culture of life.